This is Dave Pryor here at Agile 2013, and Kenny Rubin has agreed to take some time out. So thank you for coming by.
Thanks,
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
If you should know who Kenny is, but just in case, he's the author of Essential Scrum, which you should have because it is an amazing book. And you've been in this space for a while.
A long time.
Yeah, since
Agile since the early 1990s.
Yeah.
Scrum formally since 2000.
Cool. And you're here giving two different talks.
Correct.
Okay. So one of the talks is about portfolio management.
Yes.
And can you give a quick summary for folks about for the folks who can't be here?
Mm-hmm.
What is your take on that?
Sure. So the portfolio management presentation is really trying to figure out how do you align portfolio level planning and do it in an Agile-like way so it aligns really well with the downstream Agile work that we're going to do during development.
Okay.
And so the presentation focuses on 11 different strategies for how to perform Agile portfolio management.
Okay.
And so things like 3 of them align with scheduling. How do you order a portfolio level backlog? 4 deal with how do you put things into the backlog? 4 with how do you take things out?
Okay.
And then 1 with, hey, there's work that's already in process, and what do you do with that? Just because we started something doesn't mean we should finish it.
Okay.
So really the goal is to have full alignment through the value chain from the portfolio level all the way down to the development level.
Okay. And so while there's a lot going on about enterprise stuff here, but the companies that you work with, they've been dealing with this for a long time.
Yes.
Do you find that there's been a shift in the way that senior management looks at Agile or approaches Agile? You're talking about them learning how to be Agile with how they run their business and how they prepare work for the teams downstream.
Right.
Has that become less of a struggle for them?
Sadly, no. It's still a struggle for them. I'll go into companies and I'll discuss portfolio level planning with them.
Right.
And the sad part is of the 11 strategies that I lay out, some of the companies I visit do a few of them.
Okay.
There are some that do none. I think you should do all 11.
Right.
And it's not a cafeteria. You don't get to pick and choose which ones you want to do. Because they self-reinforce.
Yeah.
And so I think the companies long-term that'll be successful with Agile are going to embrace Agile through the value chain. I think that's where this is going, right?
Okay.
So, where's the industry going with this? It's got to go beyond development with Agile.
Okay.
That's insufficient because you'll either hit a roadblock in front of you or behind you or something.
Sure.
Agile comes into the development organization typically first.
Right.
But if it just stops
It
there,
affects everything else anyway. So
that's the point.
Okay.
And it's really a rough sell to tell people, you guys downstream, I need you to develop in an Agile-like way, but we're still going to do all of our work on the front end in the very traditional way that we've done it. Oh, and the fact that disconnects us fundamentally from being Agile as an organization, well,
it's a big cultural shift, too. If they're willing to take on managing their business in that type of way, it reinforces the change and the transformation of the whole company.
Right on.
Which has got to be encouraging for the folks downstream, because now they can look up and see what's actually going on as opposed to that weird black box up in the mahogany room where they figure out what's going to live and what's going to die.
Yeah, if those people at the front end haven't fundamentally embraced, internalized Agile principles, and then they can apply them in an economically sensible way, I think the organization is going to have limited success with Agile.
Okay.
And I see this time and again. We're both trainers and coaches, and we go in and we see companies all the time. And my experience is that most companies aren't getting the value they should be able to get.
Yeah, that's one of the things that's so common. I always say you don't have to do all this stuff, but you're not going to see it work. It's not going to do what it's supposed to do unless you do all this stuff.
Limited success at best.
Yeah. So your second talk is about component teams versus feature teams, or how to use them together. For people who aren't familiar with the difference, can you say something about the, what the differences are?
Sure. When you think about it, a component team builds a component. So, for example, I go to Costco, I buy a GPS.
Sure.
Inside the GPS, there's a routing component, right? There's a set of algorithms that know how to get me from my origination to my destination. Now, in some organizations, they'll have a team, for example, that focuses just on routing.
Okay.
Here's the 8 guys.
Yeah.
They really know routing, right? So if you want to add a new feature to the GPS and you have to affect the routing code, you'd be obligated to carve that piece out and give that change to the routing team.
Right.
And that would be a component team.
Okay.
Right? And so feature teams, on the other hand, I can take a feature, which I'm defining as something of value to a customer.
Sure.
And when I buy a GPS, I buy a device that gives me audio and visual turn-by-turn instructions on how to get from point A to point B. I don't buy a routing component.
Right.
I bought features in a GPS. A feature team can take an entire feature, I can give it to the single team, and
Sure.
then get the job done.
Okay.
Right, and so the dilemma in organizations is once you need more than a single team.
Right.
Meaning you're working on something that it's large enough that you'd say, we need more than one team to do this.
Okay.
The question is, what should those teams look like? Are you going to have all feature teams? Or are you going to have all component teams? Or you have a blended model? And the dogma today in the Agile industry is that feature teams good, component teams bad.
Right.
And that's on the surface a bit naive. Because given the diversity of companies and project types, it's unlikely that there's any one model that's universally correct for everything. So the presentation I'm going to give focuses on the idea of if we had a sound economic framework in place for evaluating the choices, you could then look at the decisions as to should I make that particular team a feature team and a component team, and have a sensible way of answering the question as opposed to using just dogma to answer that question. And so what I'm suggesting is that in organizations you want to optimize the fast and flexible flow of features across the collection of teams, across the system. And if you set up a framework that allows you to evaluate choices in that context, you can very quickly determine whether or not I should have feature or component teams. And in most organizations, you'll find that a blended model is almost certainly where they'll end up.
Okay. So I have a friend who works at a company that makes software you subscribe to if you want to listen to music. And they have teams set up for each device, right? Because on all the different mobile platforms and Apple TV and everything else, if they were to go to a feature model, then they would have to have one team that had expertise in all these different technologies, right?
So if a feature wouldn't be deemed done unless it was available on all different devices, then arguably you would say that you'd want a team that had all those skills on it to get the job done. Now,
but that's a lot of expertise each person has to maintain.
And it may also be a very large team. Right, to try and make that happen. So this is where we try to be practical about the structuring, right? So there's always going to be trade-offs, and I think the first thing we buy into, there is probably not an optimal solution. What we're looking for is a good solution, something that balances the characteristics.
Makes the most sense.
Yeah, it gives us good flow characteristics, but and not too high a price to get them, because there's always a cost of doing this. And so if it was a small number of people, like for example, if one person was needed to port to an iOS device and another person to port to an Android device, then perhaps they're on the same team, and I give the team a feature, and I say, this is what I want to do, and it has to work across these devices. But the issue you have, of course, is if you have an Android-only team and an iOS-only team, and you have multiple different products that each have to be there.
Right, this was the problem, because they've got, not just that, but then there's BlackBerry and everything else, so they've got all these teams all trying to do the same thing at the same time. It is kind of wasteful.
It's wasteful, and it can be conflicting.
Yeah, for them, it would be difficult to have somebody who had enough expertise to do all those different devices.
Right.
So.
And you probably will have people with different skills. Someone who's an iOS developer has developed probably deep expertise in that vertical specialty, and someone on the Android device, same thing. So it's not as if you're looking for the same people to do both. Although, having T-shaped skills on your team is obviously a good thing to have. But the idea would be, could I not form a single team that had Android expertise and iOS expertise and BlackBerry expertise, and when I gave them the feature, because what if we design the feature in a way that works really, really well on an Android device, but doesn't work so well on iOS?
And that's one of their challenges. But so this way it would allow the company to put out something that was a lot more consistent across the devices if they were to work.
I think it has that capability. Now, the counter argument to that will be, no. What you want is an Android-only team or an iOS-only team. That way, you're guaranteed that team is the one making all the decisions for that device.
Yeah, and they can take advantage of what they know.
They'll reuse it. They'll have conceptual integrity. The two primary arguments for a component team are conceptual integrity and reuse. Right, I trust you guys to make changes. You'll do it in a reasonable way.
What it can do,
You won't screw it up. You don't want me in there. I'll change that code and 100 devices will break, right? But you trust those 8 guys to do it. And reuse, right? Build it once, use it
everywhere else.
That's
But on the economic side, what you're advocating for is that companies be paying enough attention to what's going on and how the business is impacted and how they're investing their money in this, that like you said, they're not making choices based on you're supposed to do this because if you don't, you're not agile enough.
Right.
But on
Right.
this is going to give us the most bang for our buck.
Right. I mean, think of it this way. We're in Nashville.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty comfortable in Nashville. The fire stations are distributed around the city.
Yep.
That they didn't make the choice to centralize one large fire station in the middle of Nashville for the obvious reason, right?
Right.
That fire starts on the perimeter of the city.
It's too far to go.
Yeah, by the time the truck gets out there, the thing's burned to the ground and people might die.
Right.
Right. So the cost of delay associated with that is too high.
Okay.
So what do? They distribute it around. That's the equivalent of taking domain-specific expertise and putting it out on the feature teams.
Okay.
On the other hand, I'm guessing, I don't know for certain, that the city of Nashville has centralized the accounting department.
Right.
There's probably one centralized accounting department in Nashville. There might be like payment offices around the city
Sure.
to make that convenient, but accounting as a function probably central. That's a component team.
Okay.
Why? Because the economics of centralizing accounting makes sense.
Yeah.
Whereas the economics of centralizing the firehouse
Not so
doesn't
much.
make sense.
Yeah.
So I'm saying that anytime you look at a team, you've got to go through an analysis like that and say, would it be better to distribute it out, or would it be better to centralize it as a single team
Okay.
that does just that type of work? And the answer is sometimes you're going to say it's better to centralize, and a lot of times you're going to say it would have been better to distribute.
Yeah.
But to universally go, oh no, distributing
Only
them
one
out is
way.
the only way to do it. It's like, that fails to recognize that situations can be a little bit different.
Okay. So, with the idea that now companies that are practicing Agile are taking the time to pay attention to not just are we doing Agile, but what's the economic impact of that within the company, right? And how do they use that to make decisions? Do you see trends like that? I mean, if you work mostly for larger companies, you probably have a different experience than most folks, but enterprise is a big deal here. And it does seem, to me at least, to be part of Agile growing up a little bit, right? We've got the basics down. Now let's go take it back into business and figure out how are we going to mix this in.
Agreed.
You've been in this space for a while. Are there other trends that you see in terms of Agile kind of growing up?
I think the big one, so this conference is clearly about scaling.
Right.
You know, you walk around and everybody's talking about how to scale up. I think that's becoming more common because people are starting to focus more attention on making it more methodical in how they do it. It's always been an issue. I mean, you and I both work with larger companies, and you know, anytime you walk in, the moment they have more than one team, they have a scaling issue, and they have to start making decisions on how they're going to do that. So the problem's always existed. I think there's a lot more focus on how one would go about solving it, and even providing patterns for how you might go about solving it. To me, the really big issue and the real trend moving forward isn't so much scaling, because I think it's always existed.
Sure.
It's the issue that Agile has tentacles that reach out, right? It almost always enters through development, as we see it. We go train these teams, and but if you just stopped at development, you'll either hit the glass ceiling one way, or you'll hit a roadblock the other direction.
And it makes it harder for people to do it because you have those friction points all throughout the company.
Yeah, I mean, if your senior management team is not aligned on core Agile principles and you're trying to aggressively apply Agile downstream, eventually they will make a decision in good faith that will act contrary to what you're trying to achieve. And they may not even know that they did it in a way that's affecting you. But because the scope of the decisions they can make are so wide and so profound that a bad decision made at their level puts you in a compromised position on day one when you start these development efforts. You're already behind the eight ball, and you may not be successful.
And it just ripples down throughout the
Absolutely.
whole thing.
I think, to me, the big trend right now is, and I spend more and more of my time doing this, is meeting with executive teams to help them better internalize core Agile principles so they can apply that sensible economic framework on top of a core set of principles that actually make sense
so
to them.
they become less of a barrier for the team or something that's causing trouble for the teams.
Right. I mean, I'll give you a silly example. I'm in this one, sometimes when I teach a class, during lunch, I'll have the management team come in. You have 90 minutes. You got to eat lunch anyway, right? So come into the room. And I made some comment at one point, like, "Oh, managers shouldn't run around and pull people off of Scrum teams to work on their pet projects."
Yeah.
And this manager in the back room raises her hand, and very nicely, in a totally non-sarcastic way, said, "I do that all the time.
Right.
Why don't you tell me what else I'm not supposed to do?"
I always frame it as, here's how the executives cannot get in the way. you know.
And she was being totally frank about it. She's like, if I had a need, I would go to the person I thought it could do it, and I would just pull them right off.
That makes sense from their position.
And I was like, let me tell you why that's going to be very disruptive in an Agile environment. It was disruptive in your current environment. You may not have seen it that way, but in an Agile environment, it's going to be catastrophic.
Yeah.
And she was like, okay, well, what else do I need to know? I'm like, okay, let's talk about core principles here.
Sure. So do you think that, to the example that you just gave, I always feel like it's very frustrating for the teams, and they're like, why do they do this? It's a bad behavior. Mm-hmm. But I feel like at the executive level, a lot of the time, they don't even realize what they're like. If she comes in, grabs somebody off, she's got something she needs done, she's going to go get the person who can do it, but she may not have the awareness. It's like breaking a sprint, right? Mm-hmm. Then the team loses its velocity for a period of time until they get it back. The people that make the choice to, this is the most important thing, don't understand the economic impact for them of the loss of productivity.
See, that's the key. I'm not doing it at this conference, but I did the keynote at the Scrum Australia conference earlier this year. And the keynote presentation I gave was called Economically Sensible Scrum.
Okay.
And the point was to show all the different areas where, when I go to visit these companies, I see they're dropping the ball. Here's a classic. Okay. You walk into a company, you go to do the training, and I had a bunch of these developers pull me aside and go, look, it was, the developers pulled me aside and go, look, management heard that Agile embraces change. But let me tell you how they're interpreting that.
Exactly.
That means they can change anything.
Whatever they want, whenever they want.
So you see the same thing, right? And like, okay, so yes, we embrace change, but we embrace economically sensible change.
Right.
I mean, the rule in Scrum is no goal-altering changes once a sprint starts.
Right.
The reason? Because the economics don't favor making the change, because it's expensive.
Yeah.
Because your investment in the items has gone up as it moves into the sprint. Mm-hmm. However, if the need to make the change is so compelling, the core production system of the company that generates 100% of our revenue is offline. Right. I need you guys to fix it right now.
Yeah.
The economics favor making the change, so we will make change.
Yeah.
We just do it in economically sensible times. That tends to be, in most cases, at the boundary between sprints.
Yeah.
You can change the backlog for the next sprint. This sprint's locked.
Right.
But that's a rule.
Only a few days, usually.
Right. If you do short duration sprints, if you do 2 week sprints, on average, someone waits 5 days on average
to get their new
thing.
Yeah. Cool. And so I want to talk about the Agile lexicon too, because I guess you're obviously the best person to describe it. But for folks who aren't familiar with it, can you give them a quick overview of what you've put together and how people are using it?
Sure. So there's this a set of icons that I put together called the Visual Agile Lexicon.
Right.
And I used it in the art in the book. This isn't actually a book, it's an iPad cover my son gave me for Father's Day of the book. But the idea was, for years there's been sort of a mashup of different art that people would use in presentations to describe Agile. And as I was writing the book, before that even, I wanted a coherent set of art that I could use to compose Agile pictures from a core set of icons. The result of that was called the Visual Agile Lexicon, and it's used to compose most of the 200-odd pictures that are in the book.
Okay.
And a lot of people started looking at it and said, this is really cool, can I use it in my presentations? Yeah. And so the answer is yes. So if anybody's listening to this, and you want to...
Where's the website?
So if you go to my website, which is inolution.com, so INNOLUTION.com, and you just look under resources, you'll see Visual Agile Lexicon. Basically, you agree to a simple license agreement. It's no cost.
Yep.
And then you can download high-resolution pictures of all the art, and the license grants you the right to use them in your presentation.
Yeah, and I use them in my class, and they've been great because now it's a lot more consistent. And I think a lot of people, they all have their different diagrams and stuff, and it can be confusing for folks if they're looking at one as opposed to another. This is a little more uniform.
It's uniform, and it's kind of 3D, and it's pretty cool. And a lot of trainers are using it. I'm up to about 250 people companies actually that have licensed it. So feel free if you'd like it, and it's an asset for the industry to use. I was hoping it'd become sort of a lingua franca, sort of a common language for visually describing Agile.
Cool. All right. Thank you very much for coming by today. Really appreciate it.